We're both software engineers, software developers, as we run problems, which we will also go into in a bit. But we're also squad leads at BJSS, and we're quite involved in sort of our recruitment process and the general engineering community. So today we're going to talk about the search for a modern front-end developer. Sounds a little cryptic, and it should be. But to begin with, just do a little hands-up exercise. Who here is not in a technical role? Hands up. Oh, amazing, cheers. Who is in a technical role? Amazing. Who here identifies as a front-end developer of some sort? Who here identifies as a backend developer? Some of the same hands going up, that's nice to see. Full stack. Awesome. And then any other technical roles? Sorry to reduce you to the other sort of category. Brilliant. Cool. This will all be sort of revealed in a bit. So to begin with, a little bit of the context. We're going to talk about the evolution of front-end development, and then how that impacts our search for developers. But to begin with, a bit of an interactive bit. So find like the person next to you or the groups that you come with or you sat next to. If you could just discuss these points. What does a front-end developer do? How does that differ from, say, a back-end developer, for example? And how do you currently, in your company or that you've seen, recruit for front-end developers? So we'll give you a few minutes to talk about yourselves.
So I think the best way to illustrate the evolution of front-end development is to start off with a visual example of a front-end. And almost every engineer here will recognise the Stack Overflow website. So on the left is the Stack Overflow website from 2010. But first, let me set the scene. I want you to cast your minds back to 2010 and to help you, I'll give you some key things that happened in 2010. So in 2010, David Cameron became Prime Minister. Prince William and Kate Middleton got engaged. Yes, that was 12 years ago. 33 Chilean miners were rescued after spending 69 days trapped in the mine. And the Icelandic volcano that no one can pronounce erupted, causing untold havoc with flights. Okay, so now with the scene set, back to Stack Overflow. So back in 2010, websites were largely viewed on people's laptops and desktops. Smartphone adoption was only just beginning to take off. Our phone had only been out for 3 years at this point. Modern HTML and CSS, as we know now, didn't really exist until about 2014, 2016. As a result, these rather squarish looking websites with garish colours were the norm. It's a personal opinion, but I saw a lot of these and had the misfortune of working on a lot of these back in the day. So if we spring forward to today, the majority of websites visited by a mobile device. Modern CSS3 and HTML5 means that most sites are now responsive, and a large portion of these are mobile first. In order to make sure this presentation doesn't go off the rails, I'm not going to risk clicking into the actual website, but please take note the more subtle colours, the use of large images, which takes advantage of our faster internet speeds, round corners, and I'm not sure if you ever looked at the Stack Overflow homepage, because as a developer you rarely ever do. You normally go straight to the question that you want to get answered. But there are some really nice animations and subtle effects like drop shadows and stuff on that page. The front end geek, I do appreciate that, but back in 2010 a lot of these effects could only be achieved using images. Okay, so with the staging step, let's take a step back to how that happened. Okay, so the evolution of front-end development is the story of, or it's as much the evolution of tooling is the evolution of front-end development. So 12 years ago, front-end was still mostly HTML and CSS, with JavaScript as a way to add a bit of sugar on top. So if we have a look at the typical front-end setup back in 2010, so yes, as mentioned, CSS was the main day work of a front-end developer. For the most part, JavaScript was used for DOM manipulation, such as it is stuff like move elements around the page, change text, colors, and as a result of the iPhones, of Android coming out, there was a need to make pages feel more interactive to match that app experience. So as a result, jQuery quickly became widely adopted as a library of choice to add that interactivity, the animation, and feedback to a website. Now this is all to the side, so we're going to all about scripts. To show how geeky and how much I love jQuery, I created my own library. So my name is Jay. I created a library called jQuery, J-library. I was pretty cool back then. Why not? So the use of JS frameworks were typically nice to have skills, and frameworks back then closely followed the MVC patterns of backend. So, yeah, such as Symfony and CodeIgniter. I'm not sure if any of you guys are familiar with those old school. Well, Symfony's pretty big still. Yeah, they were big PHP frameworks back in the day. The popular testing frameworks back then were like Mocha and Selenium, but I think it's fair to say that the idea of front-end testing was very much aspirational. So if you look at the right, how it is now, the typical modern front-end engineering setup is, now bear in mind it's only a very small sampling of the tools available. HTML and CSS is just a very small part of the day-to-day of front-end engineers' workflow now. So JavaScript has gone beyond simple DOM manipulation. Now I used to actually generate the HTML and some rare instances the CSS itself. Bootstrap is no longer the CSS framework of choice. Front-end engineering design has kind of moved to a more component-driven paradigm. As a result, CSS frameworks like Tailwind and Builder are now the frameworks to show the frameworks of choice. JS frameworks are now the norm instead of a nice to have, whether that be a custom framework or a flavor of React or Angular. As a result, this comes with its own set of build tools, as well as linters and code formatters. 10 years ago, to add JavaScript to a page, add tag to the head of the page, same with CSS. Now, that is really evident. Testing is now expanded to include, amongst others, unit testing, scope testing, snapshot, visual, and CSS testing. And testing is now less aspirational and more the normal part of the normal workflow of an engineer. Front-end engineering now has a lot of the same rigor, I'd say, as applied to backend engineering. So only 60% of users browse the web daily, and only 40% of users use the internet for things like banking. So with the expansion of the number of users using the web daily for a variety of different tasks, has increased the complexity needed for the front end to keep up with users' needs. This is not just a front end issue, but to solve these problems at a larger scale has led to an abstraction of complexity away from the developers in the sense of third-party frameworks and services. Okay. There we go. The front end of the past was just that, a front end to an application, a website or service. Now the front end now is expected to do aggregate more. It can not only handle the user interactions with feedback, but it also integrates with APIs, renders the page differently based on screen size, type. It can handle routing, which is one of the domain of the backend. Now with web APIs, you can handle things like payments, for example. Can render complex graphics to a page using things like Canvas. As a result, the modern front-end engineer does not only have to think about how a service looks, but how it works, how it provides feedback to the user, depending on the user's needs and or disabilities. The back-end and front-end are now coupled even more tightly together. So front-end engineers need to know how to handle that interaction when everything's clicking together, and most importantly, what's happening?
Yeah.
Where did that go up? Oh, sorry. Okay. Alright, where were we? Okay, let's jump back a bit. Yeah, so a front-end engineer needs to know how to handle that interaction between back-end and front-end when everything's clicking together, but most importantly when it's not. They need to think about writing testable, scalable, clean code. To summarise, 10 years ago, front-end dev was concerned with creating the front end mostly for desktops, with very light feedback. The focus then was with clean HTML and CSS, that worked well, that provided good SEO. Today's front-end engineer not only has to think about learning new frameworks, clean code, performance, security and accessibility, it's actually good engineering practices, but also have the soft skills to communicate these needs with peers and stakeholders. However, for that part of the talk, I will now pass over to Jess.
Cool, thanks, Jay. It's not a proper presentation about technical problems. Thanks, Jay, for doing the heavy lifting of this presentation about tooling and technologies and idiosyncrasies. But how does that evolution link into how we search for talented developers? So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And having said that Jay did the heavy lifting, I'm going to grossly reduce and simplify everything that he just said into 2 Venn diagrams. So as you can see, it's not all something, but it does highlight the distinction that used to exist between front-end and back-end development. As you can see, there wasn't a lot of overlap in those technical skills, the engineering mindset that isn't on the presentation slide in there, like creative thinking, problem solving, all those things, but the tooling and technologies were quite vastly different. Compare that to modern development skills that we've listed here, and actually falling and busting out of the Venn diagram, there are continually more and more commonalities between front and back end development. And just to say, we just picked back end as a comparison for front end, no hard feelings anywhere for all of you out there. But I think they almost define each other in some ways. So as you can see, there are more and more commonalities. That's not to say there are still not areas of expertise that belong to the scope of each role, such as UX design is so far removed from cloud platform infrastructure and engineering. But just to say there are sort of more overlapping scope grouping areas. And having spoken so much about the technical aspects, if we're talking about recruitment, talent, and nurturing sort of developers, we have to mention general behaviours, as we can talk so much about technical excellence. We can absolutely talk friends about it, as tonight has shown. We can sometimes forget those fundamental behaviours that make people human and actually make the person next to you really enjoyable to work with and see day in and day out, even if it's nowadays over a Zoom window. So, when was the last time all of you have watched a movie where there's like a hacker or a developer or an engineer with the headphones on, sort of in a really cold, dark room working on the road with a black and green terminal? I'll probably say when I rewatched the Matrix trilogies in preparation for Matrix 4, which now pretend that it existed. Hopefully that's long been left behind in Hollywood. What we really want are people, humans who can communicate and converse, use technical and non-technical language, talk to sort of present to stakeholders for buy-in, and communicate complex risks and tasks. And with the last few years having turned our work-life balance and working culture upside down, on its head, sideways, inside out, culture is super important. We want people who can be collaborative. Collaborative there is a big word, it's on its own, but it also means, a nurturing environment, people who can also challenge their peers intellectually and actually challenge the status quo, as well as clarify misconceptions about different areas in industry and help with building environments. But on top of all that, for events especially like this one tonight, it would be absolutely awesome for people who want to get involved in a range of communities, whether that's in your company, in industry, or in the education system. That would be amazing. But actually, looking at these behaviours, which I think general behaviours, it's really hard to pinpoint any of these attributes and say, that's backend, that's front end, that's tested role, because these are sort of fundamental human values we want to see across the board of talent in our developers and in other members of staff. So far we've said, alright, front-end development is evolving. It's a lot similar to back-end development, but it's a bit different also. So what we actually talked about. So actually, when we've been having a look at our own recruitment process at BJSS, we reflected on sort of the industry by pulling the experience from our sort of BJSS staff and developers, and we've noticed that as an industry, we do some things that are pretty good and pretty bad in actually deciding what is similar and what is different. And I think we've got it pretty wrong sometimes. So the bad, you might have heard of something called backend bias. That is an example of that is to say, we've got Sally, who is a really, really good front-end developer, and Amy, who is a really, really good back-end developer, and saying, because Amy is such a good back-end developer, she will automatically be great at front-end development. But Sally, no, Sally has always done front-end development. She can't be good at back-end development all of a sudden. And this bias stems from the idea that our most awesome people are back-end people, and it exists in some areas of the industry. This, to me, suggests that there is a focus on these outdated tooling and frameworks, because as we've seen in the Venn diagrams and what Jay mentioned, there are more and more commonalities and transferable skills that goes not just back-end to front-end, but front-end to back-end also. But that's not to say we want to neglect those fundamental behaviours or those idiosyncrasies that comes with sort of the expertise of each role as well. And of course, talent isn't just recruited, it's nurtured within companies and boot camps and education systems. And within career progression, that means an unrealistic expectations and skills alignment. That means taking poor Sally, a backend developer, and going, you'll be great at front-end development, here you go, without any time or support or leeway to actually learn the differences and learn these this front-end expertise required to do the job, and sets developers up for failure. And it also neglects best and community practices, because some practices are great within one community, doesn't mean it's great within the other. Or even within the project. Projects evolve, practices evolve, and that's perfectly normal. There's no right or wrong answer. On the flip side of this, on the extreme end of the spectrum, you can then have rigid career plans by taking Amy, who is a very, very good front-end developer, has learned 5 frameworks over the last couple of years, picked up several languages, and adapted really quickly to learn new things. No, you don't have the tool set or the abilities to learn to become a back-end developer. And that then takes away the ability for developers to grow and learn. But having been talked about that, there are some good stuff too. So that's the appreciation of shared fundamental behaviours I've mentioned, by having actually informed and up-to-date ideas of what skills are transferable and what skills and actual learning opportunity that requires support and time and resources. You can then focus on what people can bring to the table and what people have the potential to learn and given the space to learn. And part of those soft skills that we mentioned earlier about the matrix, if you remember, those values and culture that we want to see across the board. We don't want to forget that in our search for great, amazing technical people because we want them to be human people. Maybe one day we'll have robots, but we'll see. And then the appreciation of differences in expertise. We also want to celebrate what makes us different. And I think today has shown we've got so many technical, non-technical people in this room. And actually, we want to recognise what makes each role and the scope of each role brilliant in their own right, and that gives room for developers to research and discover for themselves. And again, those best in community practices, let's take the ego away and strip away all of those things that, sometimes we can get quite bogged down, especially when the journey has been quite hard, that my best practice isn't actually the best community practice, with the word best there being quite misleading. So, with all that said and done, as with any engineering practice, we don't want to prescribe checklists and say this is this, this is that. In fact, we want to help tease out potential and value. And with sort of changes in user behaviour, that impacts changes in sort of developer styles and then changes in what we want to see in developers, it's really hard for companies to stay up to date with industry and market standards, and those standards themselves could be misinformed and outdated. Just 5 years ago, TikTok never existed. I never knew that I didn't want to read social media, I just got a 10-second video, and that will continue to change, and that's quite hard to keep up with. So instead, as these technologies and responsibilities evolve, we want to evolve the way we define labels such as front-end developer, there we go, backend developer, or even full-stack developer, whatever that means nowadays. And in doing so, we can evolve the way that we redefine the space for developers so that companies and developers can learn and innovate. So allow the box to be drawn by you, driven by your company's visions and your product's visions, as opposed to trying to fit into the box that could be outdated and misinformed. So, with that said, based on what you had a little chat about before, is there anything you would change what you say you wrote, or really just chat about it? Is there anything you would change about what you discussed with the people next to you? How do you currently recruit for developers, and is there anything you would suggest changing? Have a little chat. If there's anything you want to shout out, feel free, we'll hand you the mic. Otherwise, you can follow BJSS on social media.